Okay, let's go.
Thanks,
Thank you.
All right. Great. So we've got a good turnout for this group. I'm wondering, is anyone here because you have recently or maybe you're currently supporting or caring for missionaries that are in crisis right now? If that's the case for you, can you show me your hand? That you've recently, so let's say in the last couple years, or even right now, you're supporting or caring for missionaries that may be in a crisis. Okay. And if you're not, and you work with missionaries, you will. Yeah, because crisis, it happens to us. A little bit more about me. I think you'll appreciate me more when I say I have all my 5 children are between the ages of 12 and 19. So, but my husband and I have worked in Zambia. We worked with SIM South Sudan team. We were their pastoral care couple. And we have worked from the U.S., traveling all over the globe to many different teams. And so a lot of our work takes us to places where people are experiencing severe trauma from earthquakes, natural disasters, epidemics like Ebola, war, conflict, any of those things. But trauma and crisis, it doesn't just happen because of these terrible acute things that we think about. Trauma happens to people in all kinds of situations. There's chronic trauma of abuse, trauma of addiction. There's grief for all kinds of losses. So I want you to kind of broaden your thought when you think about trauma, beyond what we think of the shocking things, the wars, the conflict, the evacuations that missionaries go through. If you'll look up here on the board, I've just written for you a little bit. As we think about soul care for missionaries, please remember that the soul is the integration of the body, the mind, and the will. So we're talking more of a holistic approach. This isn't just how can we minister to them spiritually. This is how can we minister to someone as a whole person in crisis. Crisis is, in my mind, whenever I think of crisis, I think more of a season of time that someone's in. Crisis can be an event, but we think of crisis a lot of times as a time of intense difficulty or trouble that someone's in. And so I drew this circle here. And we're going to let crisis be this circle. Okay? And we're going to say that in the center, this is just for our purposes today as we think of crisis and missionaries in crisis. The traumatic event, some catalyst that propels someone into a season of crisis in their life. And then outside of that is this whole realm of stress. The fact, if you'll remember last night what Scott said about missionaries living in places where they're unfamiliar with the culture, the language, the people, that in itself creates a level of stress that they live with all the time, just by virtue of the work that they do and the places where they live. So they stay in a place of stress, kind of constant stress here. But then what happens when we have a traumatic event as a catalyst? Then we have a missionary who's living in crisis. And they may or may not express that crisis to us. It depends on how trustworthy we are. But I want to spend just a minute, if you can turn yourselves into groups of, say, 5 or 6, I don't know how that would work best. Maybe just turn into groups of 6 would be good. And this is the question I want you to discuss, or the thought that I want you to think about. What crisis situations do missionaries face? Okay, because they might look a little different than you might see in your church. Okay, What crisis situations might missionaries face? Take just a minute and discuss that in your small group, and then we're going to come back in the larger group and debrief it together. Okay, let's wrap up in your group. Okay, so let's collect the answers. From each of your groups, if you could give me one answer, something you came up with. A crisis situation missionaries face. Over here. One. Just one. We'll come back to you in a minute.
Illness.
Illness. Okay? Back there.
Political turmoil.
Political turmoil. Conflict.
Violence.
Violence.
We are part of that. Having a risk of life, essentially. Higher degree risk of their own life or
Their life at risk.
Death in the family.
Okay.
Death in family at home.
Okay, family death. And
Like self-identity of being smart and educated in America, but being illiterate and unable to communicate.
kind of an identity crisis.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. In the back. Sorry, I'm moving incrementally that direction.
Home invasion.
Yeah, home invasion. Okay, over here.
Lack of support.
Lack of support.
Financial support.
Financial support goes down the tubes.
Not getting their visas renewed.
Okay, visas not renewed. Over here.
I had a difference of mission. What was intended is not what somebody else decided it should be.
Ah, okay. How can we say that?
A change in
Conflict.
You mean like a change in
In
their
in
ministry?
ministry job, they not doing what they
Versus
came out, what they
expectation.
thought they were coming to do, maybe. Okay.
Spiritual warfare.
Spiritual warfare. Okay.
Rebellion of a child.
Okay, rebellion of a child. Okay. What are we missing? Let's top up. What do you see that's not there that was on your list? Natural disasters,
Team conflict.
team conflict. Surprise! There's team conflict.
Marital issues.
Marital issues.
As a fact.
Wow, that sounds terrible. Your teens are rebelling, your marriage is falling apart, and your team is in conflict. What happened?
Empty nest.
Empty nest.
Moral failure.
Moral failure. Addictions happen to missionaries, don't they? Okay. Empty nest. Addictions. Terrorist attacks happen to missionaries. Just anywhere. We'll just put them all over.
Hostage situation.
Hostage situations, kidnappings, the death of children or spouse,
Legal troubles.
legal issues. Anything else?
Crisis of faith.
Crisis of faith. Anything else you want to see up there?
Home church waiting for changes.
Yeah, home church starts changing, which can be very difficult.
Sexual assault.
Sexual assault. Domestic abuse. Please put that also. Shocking. Okay. And child abuse. Okay. And we could probably keep going more and more, but this gives us a pretty good idea. I don't know if we put evacuations on there, but we should probably add that. Definitely. Okay. So, you know, when I look at this kind of a list, what I see is that if anyone stays on the field long enough, crisis is going to happen. What do you think? As a matter of fact, I think if they step their foot off the plane, and from that point, crisis will happen to our missionary workers at some juncture. And so we need to be prepared to support and help them through that crisis, whatever it is. However big the crisis is, however small it might seem to us, we want to be most prepared to come alongside and support them. In Matthew 26, I think Jesus was our model. He asked for help. He told his disciples, "Stay here and watch with me." He said, "My soul is troubled within me. Stay here and watch with me." He begged them. And they didn't do such a great job. They fell asleep. He actually went back and kind of shook them and said, "What are you doing? You're sleeping." We don't want to sleep on this job. If God has put us in the position, the privileged position of caring for our cross-cultural workers, then we want to be prepared to do that job well. And we don't want to sleep on the job. We want to stand beside them and help walk them through the crisis that will come. And let me challenge you that if you don't know of a missionary in crisis right now, then it's just because they're not telling you. And it's not because they're not telling the truth. It's because they're just leaving that part out of their newsletter. It's like Scott said last night. There's an issue of safety, and we'll get to that in a minute. But sometimes on the field, it seems as if we go from crisis to crisis. And we never know exactly how that's going to play out. I remember our first field experience for 6 years living in Zambia in the bush and with little ones. And it just seemed like we went from sickness to medical evacuation to something else. It seemed as if we were always on this roller coaster of crisis in our life. Later, when we went back to Kenya and we worked in South Sudan, it seemed like for about a year, everything that could happen as far as terrorists around us or conflict or war and evacuations kept happening, one thing after another. There just didn't seem to be much time to rest between crises in our life. And that is the case for many of our missionaries on the field. There's just not quite any rest. But knowing this can inform how we prepare our people. and how we prepare ourselves as churches and member care departments or sending organizations, because pre-crisis preparation makes all the difference in how your missionaries will come through a crisis or a traumatic event. It doesn't mean they won't face them, but they'll have a much higher ability to recover and recover more quickly and continue to serve. Now, does it mean that they will always continue to serve in the very same area, in the very same capacity? No. Sometimes we have to redeploy people. Sometimes they have to step back for a sabbatical or for a care plan to take place. But what we want is we want people to grow and be healthy, and we want to keep them serving and ministering in the place, in the area of service that God has called them to serve, even if they can't necessarily stay on the exact field that they were in. Sometimes that happens, sometimes it doesn't. One thing you need to know about trauma recovery or in a crisis when there has been a trauma is trauma is ongoing. Growth freezes. And so this is why if a person comes for help who has been sexually abused, they can come for help and healing and receive care and counseling, but it's almost impossible for the counselor to help them if they continue to go back into the situation and continually to be sexually abused at the same time that they're coming out and getting counseling. So sometimes people have to be removed from the trauma so that they can heal. And that's just important for us to know as caregivers of people. Diane Lamberg is a trauma crisis specialist. She's someone who works with victims of trauma. And she says this, that we must understand that when we sit with someone who is suffering or grieving or sorrowing, that you are sitting face to face with a grief that Christ Himself has borne. There is no tragedy or sin, for that matter, that you will encounter in another person's life that your Lord has not borne Himself. When you care for the survivor of sexual abuse, domestic violence, war, or natural disaster, or evacuation, or home invasion, or any of these things that we've listed on the board, you are caring for Him. An invitation to care for someone in crisis is an invitation to Gethsemane. And we know that healing comes by way of the cross. But often it is a long journey to get there. And it is not a straight journey to get there either. No matter what their newsletters say, no matter what glowing reports you read, your missionaries are not always fine. As a matter of fact, often they are struggling. How can you come alongside and help them? We're clearly called to do it. Galatians 6:2 tells us to bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. And so we're called to come along and help them. What do people in crisis need? Well, for one thing, they need us to move towards them, not away from them. If we read their newsletter, or we get the email that says everything's going great, and we don't ask any more questions, and we go along, then they won't tell us. So we create a safe place for people, somewhere that they can be heard. And oftentimes a person who is in crisis needs to be heard over and over again. They don't need to just tell their story one time. They need to tell it over and over and over. And that requires patience on our part. One way that we help people to talk is we offer them a debrief. And last night you heard Scott mention about a debrief. And I know there is a breakout session today about debriefing. And there are many ways to use debriefing. Debriefing is not something magical, and it's not something that only very educated, a psychiatrist can do. A debrief is something very simple that any of us lay people in the church or in mission organizations, we can learn how to listen and how to ask the right questions so that someone can tell their story. What happened? How did you feel? What was the hardest part for you? And then we listen, and we listen some more. Psalm 32:3 tells us that when we keep silent, it says, "When I kept silent, my bones wasted away." The Bible teaches us to talk, to share. The Bible teaches us to weep. Jesus wept. Peter cried. And as we talk, and as we allow our missionaries to talk and tell their story, and we allow them even to cry, when people talk, it helps them make sense of what happened to them. So, if you have, for instance, I'll tell a story. So we had a team, and they had an evacuation and it was under very difficult situation. A civil war broke out in South Sudan, and evacuating the team, getting all the team out to a safe place. And then we tried to, within a 48-hour time, sit down and individually debrief with every person, my husband and I. And then what we did, after the individual debriefs, where everybody was able to tell their story, we got them into small groups and had team debriefs with them. And there was a lot of power in that because in the individual debriefs, it helped them to make sense of their own story and what happened to them. I always think of a debrief, it's like having a very cluttered desk where I don't know where everything is on my desk, and I organize it. And I put the pencils here, and I stack the papers and the books, and I know, then I can see where everything is. Now, I haven't removed anything from my desk. I haven't done any work, but I have organized my desk. Now I see where all of the things are. And that, to me, is a good picture of a debrief. So now they could talk about what happened before you heard the news. What happened then? What happened when the gunfire started? What happened when the plane came? All these things. And they talk about it. And then later is the team in small groups, small manageable groups. And they debrief together, and then they're able to hear other people's stories. So we saw this in Nepal as well. When people hear someone else's story, there's this feeling of, oh, this is normal. Oh, you're feeling that way too. Oh, you can't sleep either. Oh, you're still afraid that buildings are going to fall on you too. Me too, and I can't rest. So it sort of normalizes the experience for everyone. And that's what happens in debrief. And so the team, it brings the team together and kind of unifies them. Well, we can do that. And you can make sure that your people are offered debrief. You can ask them the question, have you been debriefed? And how long did it take? Has it been 3 or 4 weeks, or did it happen right away? And if they haven't been debriefed, can your church, can your sending organization, can you send someone, or can you maybe help them with funds so that they can leave to a place where they can be debriefed? That's a care plan. That's a way that you'll have to think through how we help our missionaries in a crisis situation. There's a church, and I heard a great story. It's Bethlehem Baptist Church. So several years ago, a friend of mine, this has been many years ago, and she and her husband were in an African country, and they were brand new missionaries, and an accident occurred, and he was badly burned. And unfortunately, their leadership didn't quite know how to help him. They sent him to the local medical doctors and facilities there, and they really just were not equipped to really help him and take care of him. And this couple was not in that church. But what happened was they ended up looking at their friends who were part of this church and being a little bit jealous because their church was sort of not involved in their situation at all. And they were really suffering, and went on like that for 5 months. He lost 50 pounds. He almost died, and nobody quite knew what to do with him. Their friends had been evacuated, and what they noticed about their friends who were part of this Bethlehem Baptist Church, that church had such a great plan in place that when crisis happened and that couple was evacuated with their family, they immediately sent someone out to check on them and be with them. They had contact with them immediately, but they had pre-crisis contact. The church assigned, normally in those days, I don't know what they do now, but this is 20 years ago, they used to assign, I think 3 or 4 people would be assigned to that missionary or that missionary family. And they would keep up with them, they would communicate with them, they would, really just bless that family, and they would even come out and make visits to the family. Someone made a visit to them every year. Well, this is amazing. This even blows my mind today to hear this. But when the evacuation happened, they were the envy of all the other missionaries because of how well their church was taking care of them. And also because this church sought them out, and they didn't just ask, what are your prayer requests today? They wanted to know, what do you really need? How are you really doing? And they had that close relationship so they could ask that question and they would get the real answer. And you know why they got the real answer? Because the missionaries that were assigned to that little team felt safe and supported. They weren't afraid that if they told the truth, that their support was going to get pulled out from under them like that. Or they were going to get jerked off the field. Or someone back here was going to freak out and go, no, we need to bring them back, hurry, it's terrible. They knew that these people were level-headed. They understood missions. They understood all the intricacies of where these folks lived. And also that little team made an effort to get to know the field director from their organization. So they had connections on the team. So this other couple where the husband was burned, unfortunately their church was very non-involved. And they didn't have anyone to intercede for them. And their director, he was very busy and he had a lot of missionaries, and they didn't know how to speak out and make their needs known, and they had no one to advocate for them. But churches, you can advocate for your missionary. You can get to know their team. You can find a contact person on that team for them. What if something happens? What if the spouse dies? Do you know someone on their team that's on the field that you can call to check on that couple or that family or that single gal? You can ask for that, and you can have that kind of relationship with their sending organization too. But you have to be very intentional about doing it. Let me tell you about not being safe. This is why missionaries don't tell the whole story. So when we left Kenya, the reason we left, when Westgate happened, our daughter was very traumatized. She was diagnosed later with PTSD, our teenager daughter. Long story, but anyway, very ironic story, because we were there as the member care, pastoral care couple for the team. We had come out of 7 years in the military, and then before that living in Zambia as missionaries. So we had 7 years of watching and helping Marines through post-traumatic stress disorder and their families. My husband had 2 tours to Afghanistan and Iraq, and he knew right away what was wrong with Katie. So we did what we think was all the right things as far as getting her help on the field, counseling, etc. But when we finally had to make the tough decision, and we did let our supporters know, not every detail because we wanted to protect her privacy, but we did tell them this is a hard situation. Please pray for one of our kids. When we finally had to make the decision with the support of our organization that we needed to come home for her sake, one of our largest sending churches wrote us a letter immediately and dropped our support. We were a family of 7. That was $1,000 a month. They had committed to support us for 3 more years, and they stopped. And they said, as far as we're concerned, as soon as you leave that field, you're not really a missionary anymore. talk about a kick in the teeth, right when you're also thinking that your poor daughter is going to lose her mind, and you're just very traumatized, and we're in crisis. And instead of coming along beside us and supporting us, this church that we had known forever instead said, nope, you're not a real missionary anymore. And I love them, and I have forgiven them. And thankfully, God's people came around us and made up that. And we have now more supporters than we did before. But this is why missionaries are afraid to tell you the whole story. And they're afraid to come off. Sometimes they're afraid to get the help that they need. They won't come for counseling, Patrick knows, because they are afraid of what their churches or their supporters or even their sending organizations will think. Will you think that I'm a high maintenance and I just need a lot of care? I mean, if I'm a single gal and I need to go for counseling, is that the end of it for me? You're going to pull me off the field? What's going to happen? Is somebody going to talk about me in a prayer request and all my personal information? They don't trust that either. They don't trust that maybe there's a group that will be confidential and pray for them. The whole process. And so we want to build and encourage trust from our missionaries and invite them to tell us the whole story about what they need. People who are going through crisis, they need you and I to understand grief and loss. Because anytime there's a crisis, usually there's some type of loss involved. Especially if a traumatic event has been the catalyst for the crisis season that they're in. And there are many types of losses that we experience. If you get diagnosed with a sickness, the loss of your health is a big deal. The loss of a child. If you have a teenager in rebellion, there's a sense of loss of your hopes and expectations and desires for them. So death brings loss, but many other types of pain also bring loss. Missionaries need community, and they need to avoid isolation. And so that's where we can check on them. And there's this wonderful thing called Skype. So if you can't pay the $1,200 to fly to Timbuktu, you can get on your computer and you can make a Skype date with that single missionary guy or girl or that family or that couple. And you could even arrange for a Skype little marriage counseling boost for them. And you can work it in so that it doesn't look like you think that they're having problems. You're just offering a good tool. Everybody could use a good tool in their marriage. So you could make it a regular invitation to them. Missionaries need work and they need purpose, even in the middle of crisis. And a lot of them will be very resistant, even if it might be necessary to come out of their place of service for a time. Many of them will be resistant to this. And they're very dedicated to what they do. They're very motivated people. Some of that is they're also a little bit afraid that if they come off their field that they might not get to go back. So they just need a lot of reassurances from all of us and encouragement. And not to be scolded or reprimanded, and not to be, we can listen without giving advice, or now we don't have to spiritualize. We all agree that God is good. We all agree that God is sovereign. But that is not very healing for someone who is grieving or who's in crisis at the moment. As a matter of fact, if you know about grief and the journey of grief, when someone's grieving, or they're in a lot of pain, they may be angry at God. And that can be very shocking to hear a missionary be angry at God. But that's just normal. That's just a normal part of grief. And with the right support and care, they'll move beyond that and move towards a stronger faith, hopefully as they heal. But that wouldn't be the time during crisis to try to reprimand someone or scold them for not being the spiritual giant that you thought maybe they were before. There's something, when we talk about grief and trauma, there's something called the false bridge. And unfortunately, we take this false bridge way too often. The false bridge is when we try to push someone on to healing before they're ready. They haven't really gone through the process of healing, but maybe they're still right here in crisis, but we want them to get over it and move on and get on with ministry. But we haven't walked with them far enough. And so that requires some sensitivity on our part. Okay, now before everybody falls asleep, I don't want that to happen. I'm going to give you, in your groups, I've got a story. So I want you to take this story for a minute. I have changed the names and some made up a fictional place, etc., to protect the innocent. So, and just mix it up so you can't recognize this person, but then you will recognize this person. This is a missionary couple, and their names are Ben and Sarah. And you're going to get the story, and I'd like you to sit in your group and read the story together. And then there's some questions at the very end. And we're going to discuss those in the large group after you discuss them in your small group. Okay? But before you do that, can you all stand up and jump up and down and just stretch? Because I know you're tired. It's after lunch. It's the end of the day. Yeah, if you can. Stretch. Yeah. Stretch. Okay. All right, okay, I know I have talked a long time, and I promise you, when I teach trauma healing, does anyone know what trauma healing is? Okay, American Bible Society, Trauma Healing Institute, anyone? So trauma healing it's a training for people for all of us lay people in pastoral care. And not only do we train missionaries, but we train people all over the world, local people, and it's very participatory. So there's lots going on all the time. I don't just stand up here and talk. However, there's an element of pastoral care as you care for missionaries. So in this story, I want you to consider, as you sit and read it with your group, you are the pastoral care team for this couple. Okay? For Ben and Sarah and their kids. Don't forget their kids. So sometimes people forget the kids. Read the story and discuss the questions, and I want you to kind of think of what would your care plan be for them going forward. Okay? Okay, go.
All right. Ben and Sarah, the two children, they were three-year church missionaries Oh, you didn't have Over time, she was able to report reaction, which was another huge stressor. Just before the both years, both parents were separated when they were and soon she hired a nurse. The news seemed to be God is giving her the gift to make up for for several days, she stayed in bed for 3 days. Then and now this has brought us separated. At one point, Ben Hughes had his hand and John Walker and John now the babies have brought the result of the separation. At one point, John walked over and Ben for the first time in the morning. As John went on to ask his
It's okay to get out.
Ben,
You know, is it good for all of that pain to stay inside? Really not outside like that. Time he feels so he felt a little embarrassed, and also felt like a great burden as your husband listened. It was the first time that he felt
John said offered to contact and let the church know that the church also struggled with she has and they would also like to teach every 9 more minutes and first I have I got to take some of this. How many times have you what was not charged to Ben that happened several years ago, but God trust yourself. God is good. I got some fresh bread. Is there anything else that was yeah, you know, to give it everybody needs to be invited.
one without the other.
And they was like,
Yeah.
was part was really dry.
I guess what was not
Figured out.
like agency and church. So, you know,
Christ has been
be intentional Yeah. And if you had a friend call you
I have a very nice.
I was looking around and see if there's like other missionaries, familiars.
You know, it's kind of interesting that in all the stuff that they went through, for the team that they were all so that wasn't like, this is a big trauma to you. It's like, this is life over here. So as I go or whatever. But they lost communication in that area. That's what said. There wasn't any. It doesn't appear that there wasn't anybody that's trying to like, if you don't hear from somebody, then what do you do? I mean, and I've definitely heard customers who share this stuff. And if I did share, probably share that.
Okay, wrap up at your table groups.
What did John and Amy do? Imagine you are on
All right. Let's come back together in our large group. So what was not helpful to Ben and Sarah? Anybody want to answer that? What was not helpful to Ben and Sarah?
We've gone through the same thing.
Okay. We've got, that happened to us, and then somebody starts telling their story. But that is so tempting, isn't it? So tempting to tell your own story. But it's not comforting, usually.
It's God's sovereign will.
It's God's sovereign will. Just give them a cliche, little pat answer. That did not help this couple. But what did John and Amy do that helped Ben? Say that again? Make that get loud.
They just made themselves available.
They were available.
Listened.
They listened. And they asked questions gently. Yeah, they weren't trying to get at anything. They were just asking some gentle questions so that they could learn what was really going on with Ben. What did they find out when they did that? They found out let's call it the traumatic event was the miscarriage, right? But what was behind all of that? What had already been building? What are some of the things? Water, financial sickness, tribal conflict issues, marriage, bad news from back home. All of this stuff was building. So, and those are big deals. Water is a big deal. We need water to survive, right? And everything had built one thing on top of another. What did Ben and Sarah, what was kind of their thinking when they found out they were going to have a baby? They were happy.
This was an answer from the Lord.
This was an answer from God, and they couldn't help subconsciously but maybe think, This is sort of God blessing us because of all that we've been through. We've been faithful out here, and He's blessing us with another little one. And then, miscarriage. What happens to someone's faith? That can shake your faith. It can shake the foundations of what you believe about God. Even missionaries. Right? So Ben and Sarah, this is serious because this is the kind of thing that marriages split up over. Don't they? This is the kind of thing where their children could really get emotionally neglected right now unless someone comes around and helps this family. So imagine you're the sending office, the mission sending office, you're the church mission pastor, or you're the little group assigned. You're somebody in the church, and this couple, this family has been your special care, under your care. And you get this information. Maybe John calls you. He's a good friend, isn't he? Everybody needs a friend like John and Amy. What do you do? So let's talk about that for a minute, because we want an ongoing care plan for somebody like this. Every crisis care plan is not going to look the same as it would for Ben and Sarah and their family. Depends on the situation, depends on who they are, where they are. It's all going to look different, but there's some things that are just important no matter who the family is or where they are. There's some things that need to be part of a crisis care plan. So let's put those up here. I need a scribe.
Okay.
Come back, Julie. Okay. All right, so let's just brainstorm together. If you were part of the team taking care of a family in crisis, and you can keep this family in the back of your mind, but a family or a single person in crisis, what are just some of the key components that you want in place for them? Go see them. So it would be great if you could put someone there personally, in person, to go. Okay?
I think it's really important that there is previous relationship, because sometimes if a total stranger shows up on the door and says, we're going to help you now, it's a little more difficult than if someone that you have formed a relationship
So ideally, a previous relationship would be great, pre-crisis. That would be super. Do you want to say something? Okay, so you need to find out what the resources are. And this is great to find out ahead of time. If you have families on a field or singles, find out what the resources are available to them locally or in nearby countries. Or via Skype. Do you have a Patrick that can Skype with them right away? Okay.
Funding for a need like a new well?
Funding for them, yes, funding for a need. And if water is an issue, then see if you can raise some funding for the well that they need, or some other water source, or whatever the need is. Find out, are there underlying needs that are causing unnecessary stress on this family? And if they are, what can we do to meet those needs? What else?
Well, to separate immediate help from longer-term help, so like immediately, like resources for maybe the well to relieve that, or offer to if they could just get away for get out of the stress situation, just as a family, a retreat, a couple weeks or something.
Yeah, something to kind of. Oh, this is anything maybe I should talk about. To get them away from the immediately, just to help the anxiety, to do some healing. And I'll just say, I actually had a counselor, a missionary counselor, say to me, a cruise is a great idea. But that scares churches when you say send your missionary on a cruise. But think about it. It's all expenses paid, and they're usually pretty cheap. And a lot of times, from where your missionaries are, they can get to a cruise. So, you should really think about that. So, a church sent my husband and I on our cruise after our first 4-year term. And I will never forget it. It was the most healing, wonderful thing. We were just both close to burnout. And seriously, it saved our lives.
I like that idea.
Draw a little ship, Yeah, and that's how we had our 5th child. It was the cruise. He was a cruise, a love child. But anyway, send them, yeah. And you know what? They're never going to ask you to send them on a cruise. And they're not going to ask you to send them on a vacation or even a little break. They won't ask you for that because they'll be afraid to ask, money. But you offer. Can we offer that from our churches? Can we fund that? Okay, what else could we do?
Have a plan for who's going to continue the ministry when you're
Okay.
out.
Yes, help
Back up
them.
then.
Help them think through, maybe even in conjunction with their field supervisor, who can step in for you. Because I'll tell you, this is what Mark and I hear all the time from missionaries that are in burnout or just about to be burnout, and we're wanting to stop them before they run over the cliff. And they'll say, but no one else can do what I'm doing. I'm the only one. So if you can help them think through that, it would be wonderful for them.
Something to do early on is to have a designated care team, a temporary ad hoc care team where you involve the sending church, the mission member care, somebody in the mission who has authority for funding, and they meet immediately right away and they kind of work through a care plan for that person.
Yeah, that's excellent. Can everybody hear that? Because it won't do me to repeat all of it, but just have that immediate team in place. And for a team like that, you need people serving in these different capacities, because there's going to be people who have the ability or the power or whatever to make calls on things logistically. And if they can work together, they can immediately start making an impact for this missionary, or this couple. Okay. Yes, don't forget the kids. Don't forget the children. Find out if someone can evaluate the kids, if there's a counselor or professional that works with MKs, someone that can have contact with them. And even preferably, can you have someone already pre-crisis that's already building a relationship with these kids and staying in contact with them?
Collaborate on confidentiality.
Confidentiality. There needs to be somebody on the team, the chaplain or whatever, somebody that they can go to that they know is confidential. Their field director can't be confidential. Their personnel director from the sending office, just by virtue of their job, they can't be confidential. Lack of confidentiality keeps people from seeking help. Okay, what else? Nice talk for me.
Also establish boundaries.
Establish boundaries. Good. Okay, look. So God's telling me to stop. Seriously. All right.
It's not, sometimes field leadership is sometimes the last ones to know about a crisis. I don't know why that is, but it happens often. I don't know why that is.
Why is it?
But
What do
in
you
the
think?
age of Skype and email and texting and phone calls, all information goes home, and then it comes around the grapevine to the field leadership. And we're at the end of the line and we're caught off guard.
So I really encourage churches to have a good relationship with the field leadership of their missionaries.
Yes.
In our mission, we are trained and asked when there is a crisis that we follow a chain of communication, because what happens is I would post it on Facebook, please pray for blah, 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 and then that's when field leadership is not aware, because it goes out so quickly.
And it gets really messy.
It does, and that's a good thing for us to, as we wrap up, to say, in all of this, in this day and age, we really want to make sure our care team, whoever's caring for people in a crisis like this, that you have some kind of understanding about the use of social media and keeping the information for this missionary family or this single close and not putting anything on social media about them. So, or sharing it in a way that could in any way hurt them or hurt their ministry, and also depending on where they live. So, okay, so we've gotten a lot of great ideas, and we could go on and on, but I think it's at least given you, hopefully my goal for this breakout session was to give you just a springboard. I don't expect to answer everyone's questions, and you have more answers than I have in my head. So if this is a springboard for you to go from here and work with the people in your organization or your church and be proactive to care for your missionaries before they get in crisis even, that would be great. So thank you for coming. I appreciate your attention.